Our featured book on Bookman's Corner is Beyond the Call, Three Women on the Front Lines in Afghanistan by Eileen Rivers. A veteran of the U.S. Army, Eileen Rivers served in Kuwait following Desert Storm. Eileen Rivers is a USA Today editor and editorial board member. So Eileen, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it actually started with a project that I did for USA Today. I had been a soldier, as you said in your introduction, and I started working in journalism, and I realized that I wasn't really seeing stories from people directly on the front lines. And I thought, who better to tell the stories of war than people who are actually fighting
Good
it,
point.
actually experiencing
Yes,
it.
yes.
So I put out a call to action, and I said, if you're on the front lines, a soldier, a Marine, an airman, send me your stories of war, send me your photographs, tell me what's actually happening out there. And I started getting flooded with photos. And I came across a photo of a woman, first photo I'd gotten of a female. Her name was Liz Carlin. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's right, there are women out there who are doing this, and it's not really being written about.
And they're in combat, right? And
Absolutely.
they're being shot at, and they're shooting.
Right.
That's
right. These are groups of 2 to 3 women called female engagement teams who actually attach to all-male infantry units.
Okay.
But I didn't know that at the time. So I called up Liz Carlin, that's the woman who sent me the photo, and I said, tell me about what you're doing out there. And that was the first I'd heard of female engagement teams.
I've never heard about it.
And I just knew I had to pursue the story. I called her, she referred me to other women, those women referred me to other women. Suddenly I was gathering all these stories of war.
Well, it's a fantastic book. I love what you've done.
Thank you so much.
And so how did you conduct your research? Did you travel to Afghanistan?
I did not. I ran up a pretty hefty phone bill.
Okay.
I called Afghanistan frequently, and like I said, I was sort of getting connections from women. Women were telling me about other women who had great stories to tell. And so, I was getting flooded with all these stories of female engagement teams, and I conducted my research over about 7 years.
Oh,
so it
my
was
gosh.
a lot of phone calls, a lot of interviewing, a lot of documentation. And then I also tell the story of a woman who was actually in Afghanistan. So I ended up calling her and getting her story. She was the beneficiary of a lot of the female engagement team work.
And also in this book you have great pictures. Some of these great pictures
Yes.
are in this book. Now, how did you select the 3 women to profile for this book?
Well, I'm sure as a journalist you know that it's sometimes hard to find somebody who can tell a really good story.
Yes.
So you got to find a compelling story, and there were so many women I talked to had compelling stories. But then I also wanted to key in on women who could tell their stories well.
Yes.
And Liz Carlin, who I talked about in the beginning, she's not featured throughout, was able to really tell her story well. But then so is Maria Rodriguez, so is Sheena Adams, so is Joanna Smoke. So these women really represented a lot of what female engagement teams did. And then they also were very compelling and very capable of telling good stories.
And it was like a good narrative, right? You could follow it.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
So now you served in Kuwait following Desert Storm, and how did your military service affect your journalism career?
So really it was a lot of what I was talking about before, that I was seeing these stories of war, but I wasn't really getting a lot of that first-person narrative. And I knew that a lot of what was being portrayed in journalism about the military was incredibly accurate, incredibly well told, but it didn't feel like the full story to me.
Okay.
I knew that there were a lot of women doing work that wasn't really being talked about. I knew that there were a lot of men doing things that were incredibly brave and incredibly difficult that also wasn't being talked about.
Okay.
So that was definitely a big part of the lens through which I, as a journalist, decided to tell stories, the fact that I'd had that experience.
It's fantastic what you've done. And you write about the female engagement teams. They're called FETs, right?
FETs.
FETs, and they were started with the American Army in Iraq around 2003.
Right.
Briefly, what are they and why are they necessary?
So you mentioned Iraq in 2003, and that was a group of women called Team Lioness. That was actually the start of female engagement.
Okay.
And so what was happening in the beginning of the war in Iraq is that men were going into villages and they were trying to frisk women. So if you've got an incredibly strict religious village that goes by incredibly strict Muslim edicts, men who aren't familiar with a female, aren't related to them, aren't supposed to touch them.
Sure.
Aren't supposed to really talk to them that much. And so you had American military men going into these villages trying to frisk females, gather intelligence from females, talk to females one-on-one. And so we were potentially turning friendly villages into enemy villages. We were breaching all kinds of religious and cultural barriers that we shouldn't have been.
Sure.
So there were a couple of officers on the ground, male officers on the ground, who said, well, we have women here. Why don't we attach them to these combat units, send them in, and have women interrogate other women? have women frisk other women. And so they started capturing a lot of intelligence that was before that being lost. So that was really the first purpose of what eventually became female engagement teams, started off as Team Lioness. And then the women kind of got a bigger mission that began focusing on nation building and began focusing on reaching out to Afghan women in economic ways.
And I'm going to touch on that.
Yeah.
Because there's so much in this book. So it's so fantastic. Because I'm going to follow up on the nation building.
Sure.
Because I read in your book that FET units helped poor Afghan women get loans to start businesses.
Absolutely.
I mean, that really empowered the women, didn't it?
Right. And that is a key part of fighting terrorism that people I don't think really think about.
Okay.
So if a woman is bringing money into her home, that creates a more stable home environment.
Sure.
Which then, by extension, the more stable home environments you have, the more stable villages you have. So the Taliban and other insurgents, other terrorist organizations, they really do prey on poverty.
Sure.
They prey on being able to walk up to a kid who's poor, a boy, and say, you know what, America's the reason you're poor. I can help you get money.
Yeah.
I can help your family. And so if a family is bringing in money themselves, and then multiple families are creating a very strong village, they have this sort of sense of stability where their boys aren't necessarily vulnerable to that anymore.
Sure.
So that was a vital role for the female engagement teams.
So important.
They were helping women sort of bring a sense of economic stability to their lives, and by extension their families, and by extension their villages. It became vital.
And I have to mention here that I interviewed one of your colleagues at USA Today, Greg Zoroya, who wrote the book The Chosen Few.
He's a great writer.
At about a company of U.S. paratroopers struggling to stay alive in Afghanistan while grossly outnumbered by the Taliban fighters. Had you heard about that battle, and did his story resonate with you?
You know, I hadn't heard a whole lot about that battle, I have to say. I mean, I know Greg is an incredible writer and has just done some really amazing stuff, and I got the chance to go to his book launch. I'm having a book launch right around the corner here. But I got the chance to go to his book launch and meet some of the men that he wrote about, and they just have really incredible stories, much like the women in this book. They have sort of similar parallels.
Somehow feel this conflict in Afghanistan is kind of underreported. I mean, you don't really get that much focus on it. there's so much.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because recently at USA Today, I had a panel discussion, and part of what we talked about was that very thing. After a while, the public sort of, it can get sort of disengaged.
Yes.
You know, we've been there for so long. And it's sort of like not at top of mind anymore.
No.
And so there is this sort of fear or this danger
disconnect
of being absolutely disconnected from the conflict on the ground, and then it's not reported about quite as often, probably as it should be.
I'm curious about your views about the Afghanistan war. I mean, it's been going on for 17 years. I mean, don't you think it should come to an end?
I think it's so incredibly difficult. One thing that I learned while researching and writing this book, and I say this often, is as goes the situation of women in Afghanistan, so goes the country. So as long as women are threatened simply for walking out of their homes because the Taliban threat and the Taliban's presence is so strong, it's really hard to make a case that it's going to come to an end. It's really hard to make a case that it's time for American troops to withdraw. Recently, there's a woman who's running for parliament in Afghanistan, and she was holding a rally, a campaign rally in Kabul, which is an area of the country that's supposed to be relatively safe, right? That's one of the first areas where we allegedly pushed out the Taliban
that's the capital, right?
Absolutely. And her rally was bombed. Her rally was bombed by insurgents.
There's so much.
There
so
were
much of that.
14 people who were killed because there's a woman who is trying to exercise a little bit of power and trying to become a member of parliament. And so, you know, as long as conditions are incredibly hard for women, I think that's very telling about how powerful the Taliban still is.
Well, what do you think is the biggest misconception that Americans have about the Taliban?
Well, there are definitely two different factions of the Taliban, right? There's the insurgent faction that's a little bit more militant. There's also a political arm of the Taliban. So we always say in this country that we don't negotiate with terrorists. There are plenty of times when we've tried to sit down at the table and negotiate with the more political arm of the Taliban. And, you know, we've definitely tried to put the rights of women on the table and say, part of what we want to ensure is that women have rights in this country.
Yes.
Those negotiations haven't worked. So it's a matter of, you know, continuing to try to do that. But yeah, it's difficult.
It's very difficult. Wow. Well, let's talk about your book here. You write about the Team Linus, which began in 2003 and was adopted by the Marine Corps in 2009. But it was only in May of 2017 when the first women graduated from infantry basic training. Why do you think that gender-based combat exclusions were only recently ended? Why were they only recently ended?
Yeah, so the military is incredibly slow to change.
Okay.
One thing that was definitely borne out by the female engagement team work is the fact that women were on the ground before they were acknowledged as being on the ground. The military also likes to try to test things, to have sort of backup paperwork that proves that something can work. So Joanna Smoke kind of got caught in that. One thing I write about is that, you know, she was ready to go special forces. She wanted to do that because that's something her dad did. She admired her father. Her dad did that during Vietnam. So she thought, I want to be just like my dad.
Yes.
I want to do that too. And right before she was supposed to go there, she got caught up in this WIDA, it's called WIDA, Women in the Army program. And what they wanted to do was document that women could indeed become a part of an all-male unit without disrupting readiness.
Okay.
And she thought, man, I've already done that. I did that in Iraq. I was part of a combat unit and that didn't disrupt readiness. And so she then had to go and do it again in Afghanistan. So it was this sort of, it's sort of reflective of the sort of one step forward, two steps back thing I was describing before, which is that women were doing this work.
And this is what
they had proven themselves capable. Yet the military was a beat or two behind in terms of really seeing that and formally opening those roles.
And also these women are suffering injuries, right? And being killed and being crippled. I mean, they're on the front lines.
They are literally doing exactly the same work that men are doing, and more, right?
I don't think the American public realizes this.
Right. They're coming home with all kinds of mental health issues,
yes.
TBI, PTSD, casualties of war. Absolutely.
The military was actually denying that these women were in combat for so long. I mean, it slowly has just changed, and now though things are moving in a much more positive direction, don't you think? I mean, the military is really. I think they feel we need these women. We need to have.
Absolutely.
Part of the team.
There's always been kind of a conflict between what the military formally recognizes and what's actually happening on the ground.
Okay.
So part of what I do in the book is I have a chronology that kind of looks at how women have been involved in combat actually since the first war to build America. So there was a woman who fought in the American Revolution.
It was fascinating to read
right,
that. Yes.
Deborah Sampson, who wanted so badly to participate in this war to shape America that she disguised herself as a man, Robert Shirtliff, in order to in order to actually become a soldier. She was a great soldier.
Yes.
They found out she was a woman and then kicked her out of the military, and she had to fight for years with the help of her husband and other men to get a pension.
That's the
right.
thing.
So
that's happened again and again, hasn't
right.
it?
And during Vietnam, when we were going to Vietnam, before they actually were required to have weapons skills training.
Yes.
So again, it was the need to have women on the ground before the military actually recognized, in a formal sense, okay, yeah, we really do need to formalize this and recognize that women are needed, instead of kind of using women when it's convenient and then saying, well, really, you're not actually doing this.
That's right.
But we kind of need you over here, so let's just kind of put a Band-Aid on this and use you in the way that we can.
That's right. Don't
and
talk
then
about
not
it.
officially recognize that it's happening.
That's right.
So there's a history of that in the military, and hopefully after this Pentagon ruling, that will stop.
Exactly. And of course, also in your book, there's a narrative about an Afghan woman who benefited from the female engagement teams. Why did you include her story?
So I wanted to definitely show how the work that we were doing on the ground made a difference.
Okay.
And to me, there was no better way to do that than to tell the story of a woman who benefited from that work. In addition, her story was so incredibly compelling.
Now, what's her name? Her name?
Jamila Abbas is the
Her
name we
name,
use for
yes.
her. She's obviously in incredible danger in Afghanistan, so we didn't use her real name, but that's the name that we used for her in the book.
Smart, smart.
And so, right, because I definitely didn't want to put her life in any more danger.
No.
She has enough to deal with in that sense. Um, and so her story, when I first started talking to her, was just so incredibly compelling. And I was so impressed with the fact that she didn't let all these things defeat her. So this is a woman who was married by the age of 17. We consider that incredibly young here in Afghanistan and some parts of the country.
It's even younger.
Not
Yeah, that's right.
considered so incredibly young.
Yeah.
But she was married at 17. She had 4 kids. Her husband worked for the government. She became a teacher, so she also worked for the government. And when the Mujahideen came in and was taking over, they resented people who worked for the previous government. And so they started knocking them off, and her husband ended up being one of them. And they did that in, I mean, just the most gruesome way you could possibly conceive of.
I was shocking to read that in your
Right.
book, the fact that the children saw their father
Correct.
beheaded, basically.
Right. They saw the Mujahideen drag their father, her husband, away from their home and kill him. And she witnessed it as well. And she often later said she felt a lot of guilt about that, about not, throwing her kids in the house and closing all the doors.
Yes.
But you can imagine she was in such a state of shock.
Yes,
That
yes.
who would know how to react in that situation?
And also, it was also, to me, incredible to read about Major Maria Rodriguez, who had a big mission of training Afghan female police officers to take over where the American military women were leaving the country because their tour of duty had ended. I mean, getting these women uniforms was a big deal, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things, I mean, I often think about all these stories from women, just as an aside, and think if anybody wants inspiration to persevere through adversity, read this book, because these women did that over and over and over again.
Time and time again. That's right.
Absolutely. So whenever they came up against a wall, they just kept pushing against it until they knocked it over. But one of the things that Maria Rodriguez was determined to do was find the women who were being kind of, stowed away in this little room, not working very much, who were supposed to be working as police officers. They hadn't really been trained. She was meeting with the provincial governor every week, trying over and over again to ask, when can I see these women? Where are they?
And where's my uniform? Right.
Right. And finally, like the 3rd week of meeting with the provincial governor, and by the way, she wasn't allowed to speak during these meetings. She was the only female in the room between the American military and their military, and they kind of sequestered her off on the far end of the sofa in her own little world. She never spoke. She wrote notes to her commanding officer if she had a question. He would look at the note and ask the question. And finally, about the 3rd week, her commanding officer asked about the female police officers, the Afghan female police officers, and then she was finally summoned before the provincial, before the governor, and was able to speak for the first time and say, "I really think that I have a place in training these women. Can you tell me where they are?" And so that started this journey with them, with her interacting with these female police officers. That was just, incredibly moving for her and for them, and they formed these bonds by being women, by being mothers. They talked about their children. They talked about traditions and customs, the food that they cooked for their kids, how they took care of them. And that just formed these incredibly strong bonds that really allowed her to help these women. And ultimately, the ultimate kind of victory was getting them uniforms, because they'd never had them.
That's right. And so how can they go out and patrol without knowing that they were police officers, right?
Absolutely.
And the other thing was, how have the Afghan men reacted to Afghan women beginning to make social and economic progress? I mean, that's been a struggle too, hasn't it?
It has, and it almost depends on where you are in the country. If you're out in these incredibly rural areas, there's certainly a different mentality there than, for example, a major city like Kabul. So Zabul is where Maria Rodriguez was stationed, where she was working with female police officers.
And that's in the southern part of the
That's
country.
deeper south
yeah.
than Kabul, absolutely right.
Right.
And so in a lot of rural areas, they're the areas that are the most staunchly Muslim. And they're the ones that hold on to a lot of these traditions that oppress women. And it's interesting because during my research and reporting for this book, I actually called the Zabul police chief and was asking, how are the female police officers doing now? I was getting a lot of information about numbers and progress. And I asked him about that. I asked him about the reaction of men. And he said, much to my surprise, and also I was very happy to hear him say this, that a lot of the problem with men not wanting women to do this work is a problem of education.
Yes.
And he said, you know, we've got to go out into these rural areas and educate men that women are very capable of doing these jobs, that they can do them just as well as men can, and that, you know, a lot of these men need to allow their wives and encourage their wives to seek work and to try to be police officers. There's a strong recruitment,
Right,
because there is this high turnover rate because women are constantly threatened
That's
because
right.
they're working and they're working in a male-dominated profession.
And it's so dangerous.
Right, so
now,
they're always trying to recruit.
and then what about the information gathering about insurgents in Afghanistan? Is that the main goal of each female engagement team? They are really trying to find out where, I mean, it's intelligence gathering, isn't it? And
That's part of it. And I think a lot of what these women wanted me to emphasize is that that's not all of it.
Okay.
And that there's definitely all those other tiers we talked about. The
Okay.
nation building is really important.
Okay.
Bringing medical services to women in rural areas who don't have access to hospitals. That's also a big part of the mission. So, you know, one thing Maria Rodriguez said to me, and that was reflected in stories from the other women too, was that whenever she went out on a mission, it was threefold, a FET mission specifically. It was threefold. She wanted to gain information when she could. She wanted to educate women.
Yes.
And then she also wanted to bring medical treatment. So they were always kind of performing these multi-layered missions as
Yes.
female engagement teams.
I think you should tell our viewers how Sheena Adams made a difference when she spoke to Michelle Obama and Jill Biden about her work in Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
Because I think that, again, people are so unaware of what women have been doing. And so,
Right.
tell us about that.
Sheena Adams kind of became the poster child for FET success, which is kind of
And
ironic.
what year was that? That was in was it 12?
So yeah, she was back in the United States
Okay.
by 2012,
Okay.
right? And she came to the State of the Union that year. She was invited to be a part of the First Lady's box,
Okay.
which is incredibly special and just
Yes.
absolutely wonderful that she
Yes.
got to do that. And so yeah, that's one of the things that was a great example of her becoming the poster child for FET success. But it was kind of ironic because she ended up getting caught in sort of the Kevlar ceiling. She ended up
And
because
now,
she,
what is the Kevlar ceiling?
right. So much like in the civilian world when we talk about the glass ceiling, where
Glass
there's
ceiling.
only so far you can
Go, right.
In the military world, it's called either the Kevlar ceiling if you're enlisted or the brass ceiling if you're an officer.
Okay.
So it's like there's only so far you're going to go, and then somehow you don't sort of make that extra leap over to the top. And that unfortunately ended up happening to Sheena.
So you don't get promoted. You don't.
Correct.
Yeah.
So she came back and she was being recognized for all this incredibly wonderful stuff that she did. She was invited to the State of the Union. She was being recognized in newspaper accounts, Time Magazine, just all over the country. And then she also had to struggle to try to get promoted. So, you know, when she came back, her and her husband wanted to start a family. She became pregnant. She was having her first child. And at the same time, the promotions boards were coming up. And the funny thing about the military is that, you know, when you're evaluated, even if you go to combat, your evaluation is actually on your job.
Okay.
And so she was a helicopter mechanic. While she was in combat, she really wasn't focusing on that job very much.
No, because she was doing other things. Yeah.
Right, and this is kind of the catch-22 that women are in when they become FET members, or at least that they used to be in. If you're a male and you go to combat, you're still doing your job because that is officially recognized as your job.
Right.
You enlist and you're a combat soldier and you have a specific job. When you're in combat, that doesn't stop. If you're a female, before the military opened all combat roles to women, if you went to be part of a FET team, you stopped doing your job because you weren't a combat soldier. That was never recognized as part of your official
You're
job.
intelligence gathering in a way, and education,
right,
and
right. You're not in combat because that's not really your job, even though you're doing it.
Yeah.
But you're moving away from what is your real job in order to do this combat mission. So that's what she got caught in. She came back. She couldn't be really evaluated on her job because she hadn't been doing it. And a good evaluation is part of a promotions board.
Right.
She was also having a baby, so the paperwork that she had completed to try to get promoted was somehow lost or misplaced.
Yes.
She wasn't in the office to actually track it down. So there were all kinds of things that kind of worked against her. And at the same time, she was really working to try to save the female engagement teams. She was working hard to say, look, these teams are great. Here's a better way that these teams can be conducted. And they can also be conducted all over the world in other countries where there's a terrorist threat.
Right. That's great. Now, do you think that the fight against sexism in the Army is over with the end of combat exclusion?
That's a great question. I don't. I think it's going to be hard for the fight to be over entirely. But I think that we've made great progress toward getting there. So that's a positive, right?
That's very positive. And then what about the fact that I like that line in your book when people question whether the standards of the U.S. Army were reduced for women soldiers. And you quoted an Army Ranger at Fort Benning who said, ladies and gentlemen, a 5-mile run is still 5 miles.
Absolutely. So that's what I thought you were referring to earlier. Yes, the graduation at Fort Benning for the first women to graduate from Army Ranger School, that was an incredibly pivotal moment. And the speaker at the graduation said, absolutely, tell everybody what you've seen here. Tell everybody that the standards have not changed. A 5-mile run is still a 5-mile run, and these women actually completed it.
People need to realize that the military has really modernized over the last 5 years, and so it's. And I also want to ask you, what do you want your readers to have as the biggest takeaway from reading your book?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that women were doing these things on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan long before the public knew it. That women have always been capable of doing the exact same work as men in combat. And, you know, there are other struggles that are still happening in the military, not just involving women, also involving other forms of discrimination, gender discrimination, LGBT rights. So hopefully it won't take sort of another, I consider what the FET was doing very revolutionary, sort of revolutionary effort where people go unrecognized in order for discrimination to stop.
Good. Eileen, it's been so great talking to you, and now I just want to ask you, where can our viewers find your book in Arlington?
Sure, yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. They can go to my website, which is beyondthecallonline.com.
Wonderful, the name of the book.
That's right, beyondthecallonline.com, and I have links to Amazon, to Barnes & Noble, and to other major booksellers.
Well, thank you so much for being here as a guest author.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Love your book, and hope many people run out and buy it. And thank you for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.